Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is lecture 14 in the history series. As you can see there at the bottom of the left-hand column, we're halfway through the series of history lectures. And the topic this week is, who is art history for? So this is our first time to stop and think about the whole series and what it might mean and how it might be connected to studio art practice. I'm going to do this again in the very last lecture, the lecture number 28. So this time, I divided this into three different questions, three different topics. First of all, I'd like to ask a really kind of silly or maybe kind of sensitive question. Why do art historians teach? Because it's important also to think from the other side around, not just like why do you take or why do you have to take these classes, but also why do the teachers teach them? And then second, a little bit about art history from an artist's perspective, different ways that artists can think about what art history can do for art practice. And then art history from a non-art student's perspective. That's important, even though most people here are, art students in an art school, but art history texts are not written for art students, interestingly, strangely. So first of all, why do art historians teach? So no one really talks much about this, but art history certainly exists to promote a kind of understanding of culture. Art history isn't designed for art students, but for college students in general. So in the most abstract way, in the most general way, the point of art history is to pass on essential cultural knowledge, and art historians more or less would go into their profession because they want the next generation to know about art, certain kinds of art, certain ideas about art. Those kind of motivations are sometimes really helpful to think about when you're in a class and you're wondering about why you're learning what you're learning. There's a kind of fundamental reason there that will have played a part in every art historian's education at some point, their decision to go on and get a graduate degree or get a PhD and go ahead and teach. So art history, in this very general sense, aims to enrich people's lives by alerting them to the importance of visual art. The underlying idea would be something like this. Like I said, this is really kind of tricky or sensitive material, all very speculative, of course, but something like this. You can't be a full citizen of your country, or maybe of the world in general, without knowing certain things. The difficult question is, of course, what exactly those things are. I'm just going to be illustrating these screens with different editions of Gardner's Art Through the Ages that we're going to come to in a later lecture. So first of all, art history from an artist's perspective. It's good to always bear in mind that your really big textbooks, those of you who have had those assigned in 1001 especially, that they're not aimed at you. The authors of those understood that there would be art students taking classes, but these things work on enormous budgets. I'll give an example of that in a later lecture, and they go for an international and college-wide market. And it's also sometimes useful to know that the contents of these textbooks actually don't resemble professional level art history. The kind of art history that I practice, quote unquote, professionally, that other people in art history department practice, doesn't resemble what you read in these textbooks at all. It almost, in some places, can be, in some subjects, can seem like a completely different discipline, a different field, a different kind of writing. And that's one reason why these textbooks are usually ignored by professional art historians. They're not usually written by the most professionally active art historians, and it's a common problem in university and college art history departments that the full-time professionalized faculty don't really want to spend all their time on the survey because it's not actually an introduction to the discipline of art history. For most people, that doesn't matter. But if you're thinking that you might go into art history, then you would need to take more classes to discover what the actual field is like, because these are a special creature, a special species unto themselves. Okay, so art history for art students. The question is then, how can you use these books in classes? How can you make them relevant to your practice? And I just have a couple of slides with some different ideas about that. One of the most useful is to keep a notebook of all the objects and practices that you find interesting. I mean, so you have to pass the class and you have to learn whatever it is that's being presented to you, but also you can keep your personal interests separately. You don't have to try to become invested or engaged or empathetic with all the things that you're seeing. And it's very helpful sometimes then to keep a notebook so that you have actually physically separate place where the art that really matters to you can live, and the rest of it can have to do with the class. You can get in the habit of sketching whatever it is that you find interesting and maybe writing down just enough about it so you can search for more information about it later if you want to. This is a little bit like these intuitive maps of art history that I started out this lecture series with, and the practice can be continuous. Like you can make those drawings and diagrams along with notebook entries, just so long as they're separate from the structure of the class and from what the class is asking you to learn. So, more strategies. You can also keep a list of cultures, practices, periods that you don't feel connected to. So, as in the imaginary drawing of art history, those would be things that were far away, aliens or mountains or abysses in the ocean, that sort of thing. And that could be helpful in a negative way. In other words, that can be the negative space around what your interests are. So that would be the list of things to avoid, list of things that you're not interested in as a special project. And the idea would be to try to divide what's in textbooks like Gardner's into things that you might use and things that you'll probably never use. You can also find a place for mashups of cultures and periods and artworks that don't quote-unquote belong together in art history. If you hear about something in the 8th lecture of some class of a 1001, an art survey class, that seems in your mind to go with something that you heard in a lecture 2, then you could put them together, either in a sketch or just in a notebook, because it's every artist's responsibility to rearrange art history the way they like it. At the same time, it's every art historian's responsibility to continue insisting on those timelines and chronologies. So you're not going to get much in an art history class about these kinds of mashups or collages that I'm thinking of. You're not going to get much help, and there won't be maybe that much interest in what you're doing if what you're doing is taking apart, disassembling, deconstructing, and then reassembling the timelines and the narratives of art history. But of course, that's the business of art making, and always has been. As an artist, you actually have an obligation to form your own sense of history because your imagination is not Gardner's. So I'll give an example of a notebook. This is something that was done by a student at the School of the Art Institute. She got interested in this painting, which is a 16th century painting by Tintoretto in the Art Institute of Chicago. And the subject is the Rape of Lucretia. It's a classical subject, classical story. I showed this in a lecture, the Concepts Lecture 10 on time and narrative, because it shows a single instant of time. The pearls have just broken off. The string is broken on Lucretia's pearl necklace, and some of the pearls are shown falling in midair, and that white cushion at the bottom is also just immediately falling. That's a really unusual thing to do in the 16th century, and my student got interested in that, and in this class, in that class, she was allowed to make a notebook as her project for the class. So to give her information from the notebook, I suggested that she read the things that art historians usually read about Tintoretto, so she'd have as much information as she could. So she was assigned to read text by this person, Carlo Ridolfi. He's one of the first people to write about Tintoretto in 1642. It's a short chapter on his life. So she read that, and she read a bunch of other things. And she also contacted the museum and looked at the painting's object file. Object files in museums have a lot of interesting information about individual artworks. They keep information about restorations, if they've been damaged and restored. They have a list of previous owners. They have technical information about conservation. You can't always just go and look at an object file, and you can rarely look at the whole object file because it also contains prices and things. But sometimes you can get access to them, and they can be really interesting because they're information that's not otherwise easy to find or published. So she got the object file, and I'm just illustrating this with an X-ray from another painting. But she had X-rays of the Tintoretto and so on, and she put those into her notebook as well. So she didn't produce a paper, she produced an artist book. And in the artist book, she put Xeroxes of those texts by Ridolfi and others, but she collaged them and she painted them over with gesso so they couldn't be read. So it was as if like a protest kind of a thing. She had her text that she had dutifully read, but she also messed them up and made them into a kind of like a Rauschenberg style collage, half invisible, painted over with white gesso. And then in the same notebook, she made paintings of some of the individual pearls as they were falling through midair, and also paintings of Lucretia's knee, which she thought was round like a pearl. So the reason I'm taking this as an example, because it seemed to me really opened my eyes to the ways that history can and should be destroyed and remade by and for art. Out of all the literature on Tintoretto, including the theme of the rape and all the issues and gender politics that goes into that, including the conservation report with the X-rays and the history of painting and all the rest of that, all she was interested in was pearls and pearl-like forms. So that wasn't any good as art history, and it was also really bold of her to take all the Xeroxes and paint over them. But it was completely reasonable as an artist's response to an artwork. It's the kind of thing that you can do to find your own voice when you want to speak back to the big art history textbooks. It's the only way. Something like this, a version of this, would be the only way to make art history useful. So I want to say a little bit about art history from non-art students' perspective, because most of these books are not aimed at art students. So this leads into the question of what kind of education an average student, that's to say, someone who's in like 2-year, 4-year college, university, studying communications or poli-sci or chemistry, what kind of education does an average student get from their World Art Survey? So students like that, average non-art students, if they take a World Art History Survey class, they're going to learn a little bit about many, many different kinds of art. And, if they're good students and they're studying hard and all that, they'll be able to tell the difference between a Gupta sculpture and a Gandhara sculpture, which I'm showing here, or a high Renaissance painting from a Mannerist one, so on. That's the kind of knowledge that you could get when you're studying lots and lots of different cultures and time periods in the course of one semester or 1 year. So what kind of knowledge is that? You would have in your mind, if you're a kind of like ideal student, I guess, you would have the ability to say something about unfamiliar works that you saw in museums. You wouldn't be able to say much, but you would be able to say something about a lot of different things. So you would basically become culturally literate in art museums. You would be able to go through art museums and have a general sense of your bearings, and if you saw something unfamiliar, you'd probably be able to think of some points of reference, and you might be able to kind of, guess your way or deduce your way to some kind of accurate understanding. It would be a little bit like learning ABCs in general culture, except applied to art. There are histories of art for children, from kindergarten all the way up to high school. There's a book by Horst Janssen, who wrote one of the major art history survey textbooks of world art. He also wrote a book called Art History, A History of Art for Children. So these survey texts, I guess, at any level, they're all predicated on the idea that certain objects, like, say, Michelangelo's David, that are made in distant times and places, like Renaissance Florence, are relevant for any full or rewarding life. I've always found it really strange, especially when I think about these kinds of books like I'm illustrating here. It's strange to think that there are parents and teachers who think that they should start, even with children, that children would have a fuller or happier life if they're thinking about Giotto or Monet. It seems that seems particularly odd, but even when it comes to adults, there is this question about the relation between this knowledge and a kind of improved or fuller or richer life, something like that. So I have a couple slides on the history of this idea. The general goal of cultural literacy is German. It was first developed in the 19th century under the name Bildung. It's a kind of aesthetic education, an education in aesthetics that polishes a person by making them into a picture. The literal meaning of the German word Bildung is picturing, so it means that your education develops you into like an oil painting, makes you into a work of art, gives you a picture of culture, if you want to think of it that way. In the United States, one of the principal advocates for cultural literacy was E.D. Hirsch. This book, called Cultural Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know, from 1987, has a list of 5,000, quote, essential ideas that everyone needs to know to be culturally literate. He wasn't actually interested in art in particular, but the idea that he had was to help the economy by ensuring people could be culturally literate in order to get jobs and be promoted and things like that. In the original edition, some entries in Hirsch's list of essential items of cultural literacy, they have asterisks, and that means you only need to know a little bit about them. So for example, in his list, electron is there with an asterisk, means you don't really need to know anything about electrons. You just need to know that they orbit around the nucleus of an atom. Same with the Iliad. You don't have to have read it or remember anything from it if you did read it, but you have to know that it's a Greek poem. The notion is for example, you have your first job and you're at the coffee machine and your boss comes up and starts chatting with you and he says, did you read in the paper today about this new discovery about electrons? And you don't have to know anything much about that. All you have to do is be able to carry on a little bit of a conversation around the coffee machine with your boss. Yeah, I love those electrons. They orbit around the center of an atom, kind of thing. And then, in theory, you're up for a promotion. So this is all about economics, not so much about the original German Bildung, particularly cultural literacy in the sense of knowledge of arts, but in general, a general cultural literacy. There's a related concept, visual literacy, and that's been developed by the International Visual Literacy Association, IVLA, and you can find a lot of their information online. Rune Pedersen, one of the writers on the subject, defines visual literacy as, quote, the learned ability to interpret the communication of visual symbols, images, and to create messages using visual symbols. So that's getting close to art appreciation, art history, things like that. And certainly parts of cultural literacy get close to it. But what I want to suggest with these terms, Bildung, cultural literacy, visual literacy, is that things like this are really what lie behind the whole project of art history when it's conceived as a kind of a mass or a mass educational initiative, something that everybody should ideally have. It has to do with some ideal picture, not only of a citizen, of a member of society, but also of the entire society. So a bit of a conclusion here. About for non-art students. It would be interesting to think about ways of doing that better. And you could ask yourself, if you were in charge of teaching an art history survey in a college, not an art school or university, how would you do it? Or would you do it at all? Maybe there would be a way of thinking of someone as being well educated and at the same time absolutely ignorant of the visual world. It would be something worth thinking about at any rate. So I have a bit to say here about nationalism and art history to finish up. Art history has always been inseparable from nationalism. The German art historian Hans Belting has written a very good book about this. This book is really short. It's only about 100 pages long. And he demonstrates that each generation of German art historians, beginning in the 18th century, they wrote art history mainly to define and strengthen a specific idea about German art. Here's an example of what belting means. Holbein is in every art history textbook. If you're taking the World Art History Survey now, you'll run across him. But he was largely ignored from his lifetime, which is 16th century, up until the 1870s. He was brought back into art history by German art historians, such as Alfred Woltmann, who's mentioned in another lecture, because they were looking for artists in the German past who could stand alongside Raphael, Michelangelo, and the other Italian Renaissance artists. So there was a nationalist impetus for talking about Holbein. Here's another painting by Holbein that's often in art history surveys. So the reason that you read about Holbein in your World Art History Survey is because German art historians in the 1920s wanted him as part of their canon. The same thing is true, Belting says, of later generations. After the Second World War, German art historians couldn't write about the greatness of German art or the greatness of Nazi-era art, so they had to write in a different way. This is a painting by Adolf Ziegler, who was an artist favored by Hitler, one of Hitler's favorite painters. And it has, it's an ideal Aryan, family, and it's an allegory of learning and building of culture. You can see the palette down at the bottom. But Belting says after the Second World War, it was impossible for German art history to be nationalist in that way. So instead, it promoted a kind of internationalism that advanced the contributions of earlier German art. So every generation of German art history had as one of its principal interests the redefinition and the remaking of an idea of German art. In a sense, that's not objectionable, because the readership for the text that these scholars were producing would have been mostly German speakers. And Belting's book itself is not anti-German. His point is that every nation writes nationalistic art history, that art history is passively or actively, inadvertently or intentionally, a nationalistic enterprise. That's really a useful thing to think about when you're thinking about what these art history survey texts are. Art history has always been nationalistic, and even world art histories like Gardner's, when they have many different cultures in them, they continue to express American values. Not because they emphasize North American art, because they try very hard not to, and the most recent editions have a very wide range of cultures in them and continue to shrink proportionally the amount of space that's given to North American art. So they're not American because they have lots and lots of information about North American art, but because they're written from a North American perspective, which includes the global reach that America achieved after the Second World War. It's North American internationalism that is the American politics that's in these apparently neutral and international textbooks. This Americanness of art history surveys can be really obvious if you're from different countries in Europe, East Asia, and other places. But everybody's art history seems natural to them as native readers. It's whatever you were brought up with will seem natural. This is a theme that I'm going to explore in the most of the remaining lectures in the history series. So Gardner and other textbooks and basically surveys of world art that are taught in North America in the 21st century continue to include many different cultures, many different practices, popular arts, races, genders, ethnicities. But the very idea of becoming inclusive in this way is itself an American value. So I thought I would end this lecture with that, just as a bridge between what I've been talking about here and what we're going to be doing in the rest of these history lectures. It's another question you can ask yourself as an artist. It's a difficult question. It's an interesting question because if you put it this way, it has to do with inclusiveness. Is inclusiveness actually partly, maybe even fundamentally, a nationalist interest given our time and place? And is that a way to think about how you could use or how you can reject art historical surveys and art history classes for your own art practice?